America is a land of great museums, and every museum has spellbinding stories to tell.
The Met has, under one roof, absolutely every civilization, every culture.
A museum is really a collection of collections.
You don't see a painting by Rubens. You see a gallery full.
The permanent collection here is extraordinary.
Walk a world of art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Next on Great Museums. Major funding for great museums is provided by the Eureka Foundation, dedicated to the educational power of television and new media. Exercise your curiosity. Explore America's great museums.
One of the architectural glories of New York City, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, stretches 1,000 feet along Fifth Avenue on Central Park.
The founders of the Met, we're talking about 1870, wanted a museum in which many representative examples of the great art of the world could be presented. We've shown over the last 130, 140 years that some of the great treasures of mankind could be acquired and are in fact here.
Inside is a dazzling three-dimensional encyclopedia of world art, overwhelming in the variety and outstanding quality of its collections.
You can walk in the door and literally work through the entire history of human creation, from its earliest forms through now, through today. You have to figure out your place in that universe of art and which direction you'll go.
The vast galleries and storage vaults of the 2 million square foot museum overflow with more than 2 million objects. Some are grouped in visual narratives, others celebrated on pedestals. All invite our attention.
Most people who are not very familiar with our collection are surprised to see so many famous, familiar paintings, key works in the history of art, and here they are hanging on our walls.
There's something absolutely thrilling about seeing the work itself.
The running text is, oh my goodness, that's so pretty. I didn't realize that was so red. That's a response that's good.
What I can say to all of you looking is, when you come before a work of art, if it doesn't immediately speak to you, pause, wait. Allow the work of art to yield its message.
Over 3,000 years ago, an Egyptian sculptor created this masterpiece in yellow jasper.
It is so powerful, so engaging, even though it is a fragment, clearly broken, part of a larger sculpture. Look at those extraordinary lips, that wonderful line underneath it, the way the light hits the cheeks and the hollow of the cheek. It's just one of the great works of Egyptian art, one of the great sculptures of any civilization.
Curators at the Metropolitan Museum of Art must decide, for this day and age, what makes a masterpiece.
Well, first there has to be skill, but then you can have all the skill in the world and not be able to communicate the spiritual qualities.
Serenity, chaos, love, innocence, power, desire, remorse.
It's that fundamental human quality in the end that distinguishes a great master, a great anything.
El Greco, working in Spain some 400 years ago, surely painted from the soul.
The expressive nature of El Greco's paintings, the exaggerated proportions of his figures and the soulful expressions. But the real magic, to me, is the poetry of the hands.
The Dutch master Van Gogh poured his emotions onto the canvas. The result was not accidental. It was deliberate.
Every single brushstroke has been applied with a very precise movement of the hand.
The American painter Thomas Eakins was exacting in his realist portraits of humanity.
That is a painting of great mathematical precision, of incredible perspective, light, color. And if you look deep into the distance, you see Eakins himself in the distant boat.
Works by some of the most celebrated painters in the history of art are in the Met's European collection. Here is Rubens' portrait of the artist with his second wife and their then youngest child.
You can see his love for her, and she is the embodiment of ideal beauty. And all the things you see in the painting are all symbols of this love affair that brought forth this sort of second blooming in Rubens' life and was the inspiration of many of his finest works. You're dealing with one of the greatest artists who ever lived.
The evidence is clear. The Western painting tradition focused on figure, color, and paint. In the East, the Chinese masters celebrated the energy of the line.
Painting in China did not feel the need to use bright colors. And that has to do with the tradition of calligraphy and valuing the quality of line. One of the earliest paintings in the collection dates to the 8th century. It's a portrait of a horse by the renowned horse painter Han Gan. In the lore of horses in China, a great horse was like a dragon. And this fiery spirit is, I think, what the artist was really trying to capture. The same energy courses through all things. They call it qi, whether it's the mountains and trees, animals or human beings. So for an artist to tap into that by spontaneously using his brush to capture his own energy, somehow he imparts new life to the pictorial image.
Surrounding the borders of the paintings are the written comments and red seals of past owners.
So you have 1,200 years of history recorded as part of the object. It adds a sense of the linkage between the viewer who opens it today and all of these other people who've appreciated in the past.
At the heart of the Chinese collection is a scholar's garden.
I think everybody loves this garden because you come in, you have a sense of tranquility, you've been transported to another world. That is, in essence, what much of Chinese painting tries to achieve. It's a mountain of the mind, it's a landscape of the imagination, and it's intended for the viewer to somehow lose himself or herself in this other world.
One can walk the world within the walls of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, comb the continents of Asia, America, Africa, come face to face with the art of Egypt, Europe, Greece, and Rome.
What one sees at the Met is all of those civilizations represented under this one roof.
Well, you know, the Met, it's sort of an odd place because it grew up sort of topsy-turvy. Physically, the spaces, the building was sort of added to. It's not a place where you get a linear view of anything.
Behind the splendid Fifth Avenue Beaux-Arts facade, beyond the majestic Great Hall, between the brilliantly modern atrium wings, is the Met of the 19th century. The 1888 exterior now forms the interior wall of the Petrie European Sculpture Court, and deep inside is the museum's first permanent home, a Victorian Gothic structure opened in 1880. Today, its cathedral-like space houses part of the medieval collection, much of it donated by the man who shaped the Met's collecting strategy 100 years ago, the powerful New York financier J.P. Morgan.
J.P. Morgan was an enormously cultivated man, passionate about works of art, passionate about history. Died, as people are fond to say, almost a pauper because he had invested almost his entire fortune in art. He himself collected whole collections.
Morgan couldn't resist incredible finds. This majestic Romanesque wooden sculpture of the Virgin and Child, a 16th century Milanese parade helmet, and this important work by Raphael, painted in the early 1500s when the artist was barely 20. By the early 1900s, Morgan was head of the museum's board of trustees. He focused his wealth and vision on Egypt.
J.P. Morgan is responsible for the fact that the Metropolitan Museum has an Egyptian department. And Morgan understood that the best way in the early 20th century of collecting Egyptian art was to excavate.
More than half of the Met's Egyptian collection of nearly 36,000 objects is derived from the museum's first 30 years of archaeological work in Egypt.
If you walk around the galleries, you can go through all of Egyptian history. You don't just see the great pieces that are the kings, you also get a feel for things that ordinary people would have had, and it brings the culture closer to an individual viewer, which I think is really important.
The mummy is one of the most potent symbols of ancient Egypt. Its purpose was to provide a safe haven for the spirit in the afterlife by preserving the body.
One of the most magical decorations on early coffins are the two eyes on the side. We assume that the eyes allow the mummy to look out of the coffin. Later on, you get anthropoid coffins. They're sort of mummy form. They have a face. And in those, the person is placed on his back or her back and can look out through the face.
In the 1920s, the Met's archaeological team made a spectacular discovery in Thebes, at the ancient tomb of a great noble named Meketra. All had been destroyed, except one small hidden chamber, untouched since Meketra's funeral 4,000 years ago.
What they found inside were 12 little boxes with scenes inside, bakers and brewers who are making food. We have a stable where the people are force-feeding cattle, preparing them for slaughter, and we have the slaughterhouse.
In the afterlife, Meketra would also need the service of this goddess.
And she is wearing a long gown that has a sort of feather pattern on it. Only goddesses usually wear feathered gowns. All of the paint on that figure is just beautifully preserved. People who walk in there think they're models. Well, they are models, but they were made in about 2000 BC, so they're 4,000 years old.
These monumental statues are of Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's few female pharaohs. Hatshepsut came to the throne as regent for her nephew, Thutmose III.
About 20 years after her death, Thutmose III smashes all of her monuments.
Eyes and noses, even whole faces, were hacked away. For 3,000 years, the countless fragments lay scattered in a quarry until the Met's archaeologists stumbled upon them in the 1920s. Reassembling the pieces was painstaking.
Because it's like putting a puzzle together without the photograph. And you don't have enough pieces. And some of the pieces weigh half a ton, and some of them are as big as your fist.
The reassembled statues reveal Hatshepsut in the appearance and attire of a male king.
And then we have the beautiful white statue, which a lot of people say looks feminine and delicate, which it does. She's wearing the male kilt, and she is wearing the Nemi's headcloth. But for most people, she looks like a more feminine image.
From the boy king Tut to the gargantuan Roman-era Temple of Dendur, the collection of ancient Egyptian art at the Metropolitan Museum ranks among the finest outside Cairo.
The museum, some people say, operates like 19 little museums all in one. It almost has to because it's such a big place.
Big enough to house a grand equestrian court.
The Metropolitan Museum's collection of arms and armor is probably the most encyclopedic of any in the world. That is, we have over 14,000 objects that span about 1,500 years and cover almost every major civilization of the world.
In Japan, the counterpart of the knight in shining armor was the samurai warrior, armed with his famous curved sword. Japanese armor was made of small plates of leather or iron, held together by silk laces.
It was form-fitting, and at the same time, that boxy skirt around the base telescoped up around the rider on horseback and created a natural defense around his midsection.
This 14th century example is exceedingly rare. It belonged to Ashikaga Takauji, a leading general and shogun of Japan. A German master craftsman, Kunstlautner, made this superb set of horse and body armor for the Duke of Saxony in the 1530s.
Many of the objects here are showpieces. The sculptural form, the inherent beauty of the decoration, the physical presence of the objects is overwhelming.
This field armor belonged to one of England's best-known kings, Henry VIII.
The armor was made about 1544 when Henry, much married, decided to, with a last spurt of vigor, go to war personally. For the first time in over 3 decades, he mounted a horse and rode off into battle, this time to France, taking with him thousands of English troops with the idea of capturing Paris.
His armor was brilliant. His plan was not. Surprisingly, plate armor was highly functional.
This is the gauntlet belonging to a field armor of King Philip II of Spain. If you imagine a lobster and the articulation of its shell and how it moves, that's very much the way that armor moves. It's, in miniature, a masterpiece of both anatomical design, function, and decoration. As in any aspect of the Metropolitan Museum, a closer look is always the most convincing that we are indeed in the presence of great works.
The extraordinary timelessness of this place is very humbling. It's humbling to be one of those people who hangs the works of art and makes the choices.
In the 19th century, paintings were hung salon style, frame to frame, floor to ceiling, with the most important works at eye level. In today's American salon, take a turn and suddenly there it is, Emanuel Leutz's vision of Washington crossing the Delaware.
It really does become the icon of the American wing. It's shown again and again and again and reproduced probably more than any other picture in our collection. A work of art in the gallery follows, for your average visitor, what I like to call the precious object tradition. That is, it's in the Metropolitan Museum, it's on a pedestal, it's clean and shiny, it's beautiful, it must be a masterpiece. You walk into the Luce Center, and we like to think that we've sort of thrown a wrench into that.
The Henry Luce Center for the Study of American Art is a visible storage area.
The Luce Center is interesting because it allows people up front, right away, to know the collection from which we're making our choices.
The range of objects is staggering. An endless wall of empty picture frames, statuary, row after row of paintings of all kinds. The cases are crowded with silver from all periods. Chairs of all styles, tables, clocks, china, shelves of Tiffany glass.
From one generation to the next, from one curator to the next, with a different eye, with a different bias. What may be relegated to the Luce Center for one curator is pulled out and put in the primary galleries for another.
Richly displayed in the American wing are masterworks by John Singer Sargent.
If you go back and forth between the Luce Center and the galleries, you get a sense of the range in his work, from student productions and studies for murals all the way through finished society portraits.
The concept behind the Luce Center goes back to the whole notion of connoisseurship being the study of works of art comparatively.
In the primary galleries, a comparison of 19th century landscape painting, American style, shows an evolving preoccupation with the effects of light and atmosphere. Note the opalescent sky and water in George Caleb Bingham's Fur Traders Descending the Missouri, and the exciting contrast of gloom and light in Martin Johnson Head's Coming Storm.
There are little narratives all over the American wing, carefully placed objects meant to tell you some sort of story or to give you some bit of information.
In a gallery filled with Winslow Homer's later works, his northeaster blows and bellows with raging energy. Nearby, in a quiet corner, John Twachtman's River Sea, a masterwork of American Impressionism, provides a safe harbor.
There is never a painting hung next to another without some consideration of what the two might say to each other.
Repose, by John Alexander White, captures a carefree moment in which this languid figure seems to float away. She shares a gallery with this bold beauty, by Thomas Anschutz, titled The Rose.
And the rose, although a small component, a mere prop, really becomes a personification of her, doesn't it?
There are over 17,000 works in the Met's American art collection, from colonial times through the early 20th century. Throughout the American wing, 24 period rooms, museums provide context for the paintings, sculpture, and decorative arts on display.
In our field of American art, we have the right to call ourselves the most comprehensive collection of American art in the world.
Success for an art museum cannot be measured quantitatively. It has to do with how deeply the museum is able to make an impact on its visitors.
In the Met's 19th century European collection, many of the paintings, mostly French, are incomparable.
The Courbet, Woman with a Parrot. It's a shocking painting. Courbet's handling of paint, his depiction of flesh is sufficiently realistic as to cause very strong reactions on the part of viewers today.
Another Woman with a Parrot dwells nearby. This one by Courbet's rival Edouard Manet, almost certainly a satirical commentary on Courbet's nude. Of course, 19th century Paris was also the center of the Impressionist universe.
The stories are as simple as walking through a hayfield with poppies on a beautiful sunny day. All you have to do is be human to recognize the pleasure in such an image.
At the Met, there are water lilies by Monet, sunflowers and cypresses by Van Gogh, apples and primroses by Cézanne, a parade of early works by Gauguin and Matisse, and Renoir's stunning group portrait, Madame Charpentier and her children.
In other words, the most important collection of Impressionist and Post-Impressionist painting in America.
Key works came from the peerless private collection of a true art connoisseur, Louisine Havemeyer, wife of the sugar baron, H.O. Havemeyer.
Louisine Havemeyer became very much a student of art in addition to simply a collector or amasser of objects.
As a teenager, she visited Paris in 1874, where she met and befriended the American artist Mary Cassatt. She became a devoted collector of Cassatt's work.
Not merely for the companionship, but because she saw how beautiful the paintings were, how great they would become. In Young Mother Sewing by Mary Cassatt, you see some of her most popular imagery, the imagery that she's best known for, that is the subject of mothers and children. She used friends and family in her compositions, painting them quite beautifully and showing herself to be every bit the worthy colleague of the great French Impressionists.
Guided by Cassatt, Louisine Havemeyer became one of the earliest collectors of Impressionism. Above all, she favored Edgar Degas.
She wanted to have early works and late works. She wanted to have finished paintings as well as informal studies. What she made was an exhaustive and comprehensive collection of his work, which makes me believe that she fully understood his achievement and wanted to document it. Two dancers practicing at the bar is an example of Degas' wit at play. The fact that he included a watering can at the bottom left, mimicking with its spout the angle of the dancer's feet, shows his cleverness in making a visual analogy.
An entire gallery at the Met is devoted to the Havemeyer collection of Degas' bronze sculptures, featuring his twin fascinations, horses, and ballerinas. Center stage in the Havemeyer collection is Degas' irresistible 14-year-old dancer, standing tall at 3 feet, 3 inches. All in all, Louisine Havemeyer collected the largest and most complete collection of Degas' work ever formed.
And all of this really for the Metropolitan. I mean, the Metropolitan was always in her mind as the ultimate recipient of the collection.
The museum is really a collection of collections. As a result, we have suites of objects that really tell a story in a more complex and complete manner than if we were to buy a single example.
The Met is a vast storehouse of art, knowledge, and inspiration. It's a place to return to over and over again, to savor in small doses, to lose yourself in thought, or to immerse yourself in the wonders of human creativity.
Once you become comfortable, you'll discover again the things that mean most to you.
You could indeed come back again and again and again over the years and learn something new every single time.
It is only a short walk from Jackson Pollock's Autumn Rhythm to the abstract elegance of Egyptian hieroglyphs. From an Indian goddess Parvati to Titian's Venus and Adonis. From a bronze head by Picasso to a West African reliquary head.
The Met is in fact several museums in one. And I think that's one of its great advantages, because it means that you can make those wonderful comparisons, appositions, contrasts. It's all there, and one is traveling the globe.
Since its founding in 1870, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City has amassed the most impressive collection of art in the Western Hemisphere.
The Met has, under one roof, absolutely every civilization, every culture over 5,000 years of recorded history, and that is absolutely unique. The aura that is conveyed is one of majesty.
Walk into that great hall with its flowers and people and high ceilings, and it's a monumental space. You know, it speaks of the ages.
It is also dynamic, constantly enriching its collections.
The permanent collection here is extraordinary.
You come here, you don't see a painting by Rubens. You see a gallery full. You see early works and latest. You see the earliest and the latest.
You, the visitor, may say, I don't see much in this. Well, that may very well be. There is no right and there is no wrong, and what the art museum does is it awakens in the visitor a sense of critical evaluation. In the 130 plus years of our history, the mission, the charter, the bylaws of the museum has scarcely changed. It remains to acquire, to preserve, to publish, and to make accessible the great art of the world.
In 1870, this Roman sarcophagus was the very first object to enter the collections of New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. From there bloomed the Met's magnificent Greek and Roman department. Here, the ancient Mediterranean world comes alive in bronze, terracotta, jewelry, glass, and marble. The Joharis Gallery paves the way.
This wonderful vaulted gallery flooded with light, where from one moment of the day to the other, the sculpture changes as the light sculpts the sculptures.
And it is a timelessness of Greek art and Roman art, which I think encourages us to look at them over and over again.
Like the image on this terracotta vase, attributed to the classical Greek painter Euphronius.
Euphronius is arguably the most noble and the most accomplished of the early red figure painters. The way the composition is framed by two standing figures, the balance of the red and the black, and the beautiful use of ornament.
The scene depicts the hero Sarpedon being carried from the battlefield by the personifications of sleep and death.
It is a noble, grand scene.
The Greeks learned monumental sculpture, for the most part, from Egypt. The ancient Egyptian influence on Greek sculpture is evident in the rigid pose of early male figures known as kouroi, which often marked graves.
And ours is one of the earliest to have survived in good condition. And each generation shows the male figure in a more naturalistic portrayal.
By the 5th century BC, Greek sculptors had perfected classical form. Here is the wounded warrior.
It's a bold composition, figure in great action, and yet we know that he's about to collapse.
Most Greek sculptures survive today through marble copies made by Roman artists. The Greek originals were bronze and were melted down or rusted away. But the Romans were artists in their own right. This row of portrait busts represents 300 years of Roman sculpture, from the 1st century to the 4th.
You can in a way see the whole gamut of the Roman Empire on one fell swoop.
So powerful is the classical tradition of Greece and Rome that for more than 2,000 years it has defined the Western view of beauty. This great 19th century work by Antonio Canova shows Perseus, son of Zeus, holding the head of Medusa, whose gaze could turn mortals to stone.
The Perseus is one of the great sculptures of the neoclassical period, both in terms of its artistry and purity of line, and I think it holds a position of great honor and majesty in the middle of that court.
Perseus is male, body beautiful from the Western point of view. Here is the Asian Indian ideal of female perfection. The shapely figure of the celestial dancing Devata is beautiful, though her contorted pose is utterly fantastic. Ancient Indian sculpture from the area now known as Pakistan reflects the definite influence of the West, most likely the result of Alexander the Great's conquests or first-century trade with Rome. In striking contrast is the pure Indian aesthetic, developed around the 5th century during India's classical age, the Gupta period.
The Gupta period is a period of transformation where finally Indian art really comes into its own. This Gupta Buddha is one of the great icons of Indian art. The nose like a parrot's beak, the eyebrows like an archer's bow, the folds of the robe, although you sense the body beneath, there's also this sense of this dematerialization that's going on in front of you.
The unique artistic vocabulary of literary metaphors is fully realized in this superb bronze of the Hindu goddess Parvati.
In this case, you'll notice the extremely narrow waist, which is likened to a damaru, a kind of an Indian drum that is hourglass shaped. The breasts are like ripe melons. The head is like an egg. The left arm is like an elephant's trunk. There's almost no sign of the elbow.
Not all sculpture at the Met is metal or stone. These three-dimensional treasures were sculpted from cloth. In the Met's Costume Institute, conservators care for a collection of clothing that spans 7 centuries and 5 continents.
What we do here is interpret these objects as art.
This is really, really typical of the 18th century, where the interior...
The Met's costume art collection contains nearly 80,000 individual pieces, from fashionable dress and regional clothing to shoes, undergarments, and even buttons.
And people are always really shocked because of the size, but at this time, men's buttons were enormous, and they were really a large decorative element on a tailcoat.
This row of 18th century court dresses is ready for inspection and conservation.
This fabric alone was very, very costly. You can see all the gold and the silver.
In the 18th century, there was a spectacular manifestation of women's dress called the pannier gown. We have an English court gown with the most extraordinary elbow-shaped panniers. They stick straight out of the side of the waist and drop straight down on either side.
The Costume Institute at the Met seeks out masterworks of clothing and design that advance the art of fashion.
But that doesn't mean to say that we don't also enjoy hearing someone say, I would never wear that, or I would love to wear that.
Built on the shoulders of capitalism, the Metropolitan Museum of Art owes many of its treasures to the enormous wealth and generosity of America's captains of business and industry.
And many of them, in fact, formed their collections with the Metropolitan in mind.
Financial giant Robert Lehman spent a lifetime assembling what would become one of the greatest private collections of the 20th century.
Robert Lehman and his father Philip were collectors on a very grand scale, and it's a collection which stands on its own, in its own wing at the Met.
The Lehman collection is uniquely displayed in rooms that evoke the setting of a private home.
You can put yourself in any of the armchairs in the Lehman wing, stay there as long as you please, and imagine that you too have an El Greco over the fireplace. There are very few categories of art that are left out of the Lehman collection.
Lehman's personal favorite was this portrait by the 19th century French artist Ingres.
The Ingres portrait of the Princesse de Broglie is widely considered one of the most beautiful paintings in the world. All the textures and details portrayed with such brilliant accuracy as to leave almost nothing to the imagination, but in the most positive possible sense.
Lehman's real passion was art by the Italian painters of the early Renaissance, preeminent among them Botticelli. Early Italian artists were restrained not only by their subject matter, religion, but also by their medium. They painted mostly on wood with tempera, a mixture of pigment, water, and egg yolk. But superior skills and fertile imaginations triumphed over the limitations of the paint and surface. Here, Giovanni de Paolo depicts two scenes from the 15th century view of the universe, the creation and the expulsion.
In the center of the painting is a small disc which represents Earth. Around Earth are the spheres of the four elements and the known planets. And God the Father, on a cloud of angels, floats in from the left and sets all the spheres in motion, which will initiate the cycle of creation.
Painted barely 5 years later, but a world away, the detailed sophistication of this painting by Flemish artist Petrus Christus was due in part to the recent invention of oil paint, which would revolutionize the Western art world. Titled Saint Eligius, the patron saint of goldsmiths, it shows a young couple come to seek a wedding ring. A mirror reflects two onlookers outside.
Behind the goldsmith are rings, coral, crystal cups, gold work, the sort of thing that you would find in Tiffany's 500 years ago.
Of the Dutch and Flemish, I would say that there is much more emphasis upon rendering the surfaces, the material has about it a kind of heightened realism.
Perhaps the most inspired early practitioner of painting with oils was Jan van Eyck. His Crucifixion and Last Judgment hang in the Met's comprehensive European painting department.
In his hands, painting in oil is raised to perfection. And with oil glazes, he's able to describe with his brush unbelievable details.
The rural life is the subject of Peter Bruegel's masterpiece, The Harvesters.
The artist is no longer using a religious subject to show a landscape. These are working people, peasants, who have been taking a break for their noonday meal, and some of them have fallen asleep. And you can see them stretched out on the hay, and extraordinary details throughout the entire picture.
The 17th century was the golden age of Dutch and Flemish painting, the period of the old masters. The Met has rooms filled with Rembrandt, Rubens, and the rarest of all, Vermeer.
If you come to the Met, you don't see one Vermeer. You see 5. It's extraordinary. You see one of the earliest known works, and you see a very characteristic late one. And then you see one of the greatest of all, which is the woman with the silver jug. He's able, in the small canvas, to describe this entire world centered around this woman as she's doing her household chores in this beautiful light that illuminates the scene.
The miracle of oil spread throughout Europe, from Titian and Raphael in Italy, Delatour and Poussin in France, to Diego Velázquez in Spain.
Every painter who's lived admires the way he handled a brush.
While in Rome, Velázquez painted his Moorish servant as a warm-up exercise for a planned portrait of the Pope.
He's actually stroking the canvas with the brush. He's not using even a palette in order to mix the colors.
He mixed the colors directly on the canvas. Next to wear the mantle of master in Spain was court painter Francisco Goya.
The child looks out kind of innocently. There is evil in the painting. You can see in the shadows these sinister eyes of these cats that want to jump on the birds and eat them.
By the 18th century, the practice of oil painting had been nearly universal for 100 years. But artists working in America had some catching up to do. In colonial times, John Singleton Copley, America's first significant native-born artist, successfully modeled his likenesses of America's elite after works by English masters, despite his lack of formal training.
The only thing about this picture that is unique to Mrs. Bowers is the face. We know that her dress, her dog, her sofa, her landscape, even her hairdo and her jewelry come from a painting by Sir Joshua Reynolds of Lady Caroline Russell. And Copley understood his colonial patrons, wanted to keep up with the fashionability of their London neighbors.
Until the 19th century, most American painters either weren't Americans by birth or they trained in Europe.
Which means that the works that they painted upon their return are necessarily international in flavor.
This would include the great portrait of George Washington by Charles Wilson Peale, who studied in London prior to fighting in the Revolutionary War, and this familiar image by Gilbert Stuart.
By the time he was a teenager, he had left for England and didn't come back for 20 years.
He returned in 1793 to paint the nation's founding father and greatest hero. American Thomas Sully aimed to paint true royalty, Queen Victoria. This small canvas is the oil study that Sully carried back and forth to Buckingham Palace for his sittings with the Queen. Beside it hangs the finished masterpiece.
Sully was the first American painter to portray Queen Victoria. He found her so delightful and charming that he wrote in his diary that he hoped that he could give a sense of the kind manner and dignity of the young queen.
Born in England but long resident in Philadelphia, Sully worked free of the conventions that tied English court painters.
Now, this isn't to say that he painted a rakish image, but the idea that Queen Victoria would be literally ascending the throne, climbing the staircase up to the throne and looking back over her bare shoulder is really extraordinary.
The best of late 19th century American portraiture tends to be something more than straightforward likenesses. Even realist Thomas Eakins seems to paint psychological profiles. This portrait of his wife was reworked to increase the pathos of her expression. The master of American portraiture was John Singer Sargent. His provocative painting, Madam X, is the anchor work in a gallery devoted to images of society folk.
With such a stunningly beautiful and striking image, just like the woman was herself.
The woman was Madame Gautreau, the New Orleans-born wife of a French banker. She became one of the most notorious beauties of Paris in the 1880s.
The short version of the story is that when Sargent painted it, the shoulder strap of the dress that she's wearing was falling down off one arm, and that in itself created such a degree of attention that he was asked to fix the strap, to put it back on her shoulder.
When Sargent sold Madame X to the Met in 1916, he supposed it was the best work he'd ever done. Initially scorned by the establishment, the Impressionist painters of the late 19th century are now universally admired as the first true expressions of the modern spirit. The Annenberg collection at the Met boasts over 50 Impressionist and early modern masterpieces: Renoir, Van Gogh, Gauguin, Braque, and this early self-portrait by Picasso. The collection was built with the fortune made by publishing magnate Walter Annenberg, creator of TV Guide.
By the time the Annenbergs began collecting in earnest in the 1960s and 70s, these artists were very famous, very expensive artists.
The Annenbergs contributed more than a half dozen of Van Gogh's works to the museum in the 1990s, complementing other paintings by Van Gogh already in the Met's permanent collection.
Any visitor here can come across the rather rude beginnings of Van Gogh's art, that earnest, self-taught, struggling artist who became ultimately a consummate technician.
The crowning glory came in 1993 when Walter Annenberg and his wife Lee acquired Wheatfield with Cypresses for the Met.
It's one of the great paintings of the 19th century. It's one of the sublime works of Van Gogh.
The strong colors, the artist's touch, the impasto, you can see the visible traces of the artist's work left on the canvas. Grains of seed that were literally blowing in the wind that day. So fresh was the paint and so fervid was his painting manner that these seeds were embedded in the paint surface.
This was a picture also from the point of view of Van Gogh's own career that emerged out one of the darkest moments of his life in 1889. He summarizes his own discovery of the importance of the cypress its symbolism representing death, the cypress appearing in all of the cemeteries in France, and also that soaring shape leading to the skies and to heaven.
The great masters of any time or place strive not to copy, but to create their own unique visions, which is why there will always be something called modern art. At the Met, modern art begins with the 20th century. A stroll through the galleries reveals an astonishing diversity of creative expression given to the human form. Modigliani, Miro, Picasso. Early 20th century modernists pursuing cubism and fauvism were intrigued by the unfamiliar ways in which primitive cultures depicted the human form. The influence of African masks is evident in this bronze by Picasso.
African masks made to propitiate the gods have a tremendous power, but they are also harbingers of some of the best abstract art created in the West, which is why people like Braque and Picasso collected African masks.
This finely carved ivory mask is from the 16th century West African kingdom of Benin. It's believed to portray the mother of the Oba, or ruler.
We basically, in this museum, seek to include the art of the entire world, and the arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas represent a very significant portion of that art. And this actually includes most of the arts and cultures of the world.
Our holdings in the arts of Africa, Oceania, and Mesoamerica open the eye to the ineluctable fact that it is in the nature of man to want to express themselves even in the most ordinary objects in an aesthetic way.
In the early 20th century, these objects were regarded as ethnographic material, better suited for a natural history museum. But New York politician Nelson Rockefeller saw them as art, as did his son Michael.
And Michael was very enthusiastic about his father's passion for art, particularly art from the Pacific. And so after he graduated from college, he decided that he was going to go personally to New Guinea.
Which he did. It ultimately cost him his life. Reportedly, in 1961, he tried to swim ashore when the motor on his boat failed. His body was never found. The Michael C. Rockefeller Wing at the Met opened in 1982. Some of the most striking pieces were collected by Michael himself.
Michael spent some time in the highlands of New Guinea, but he spent the majority of his time down with the Asmat people.
The Asmat people are prolific and accomplished wood carvers. They are also head hunters.
The towering beach poles form one of the most dramatic displays, I think, in the entire museum.
The figure at the top represents an Asmat warrior recently killed in battle. Each pole is carved from a single upside-down tree. While the top of the tree points to the ground, the remaining root, representing the phallus of the pole, is fashioned into a projecting wing with intricate carvings of enemies killed by the warrior.
So in a way, the carvings can be said to represent a resume.
In Oceania, there are 1,200 different cultures and languages and hundreds of religions and artistic traditions. A common practice in oceanic cultures was ancestor worship.
Now, these may be fantastic creatures, but to the people who create them, these are what these beings look like.
From the Polynesian islands, this giant slit gong is basically a musical instrument. A wide, hollowed-out tree trunk forms the body of the ancestor. Hair surrounds the face with its large plate-like eyes, and a long slit mouth down the front. There was often a special carver who made only the nose.
One of the things that I always asked myself was, why would somebody make an image like this?
The questions, like the world of art itself, are never-ending. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's mission requires that it remain a work in progress.
No museum in the world stops collecting. No matter how much you have, there are always gaps. One never has so complete a picture that you can simply close the book.
We'll never know everything. That, of course, is the joy of scholarship. There's always something else to learn and to know.
That's the wonder of works of art. They're unfathomable. You cannot complete them. You cannot complete them.
Learn more about America's great museums at greatmuseums.org. You can order this episode or another Great Museums program. Call 1-888-227-5865 or order online at greatmuseums.org. uncouple the treasures and tell the tales of the people and places that make America great. Funding for great museums is provided by the Eureka Foundation, dedicated to the educational power of television and new media. Exercise your curiosity. Explore America's great museums.